Welcome to The World Today, a program at Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's global affairs think tank. I hope everyone is safe and healthy. My name is Michael Horowitz. I'm the director of Perry Worldhouse and a political science professor at Penn. Today's guest is Dr. Koko Warner. Dr. Warner is a visiting fellow at Perry Worldhouse, and she has served as manager of the Climate Impacts, Vulnerability, and Risks subprogram at the United Nations Framework on Climate Change since 2016. From 2006 to 2016, she was the executive director of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. In 2014, the International Council of Science named her one of the top 20 women making waves in the climate change debate. Her work's been published all around the world and in some of the most important outlets, including Nature Climate Change, and she has a PhD in economics from the University of Vienna. She's the perfect person to talk to us about the intersection of coronavirus and climate change. Koko, thanks for joining us today at Perry Worldhouse, and the floor is yours to give us some introductory thoughts about climate change and COVID-19.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Mike, and hi everyone. I wish I could actually see you. I'm just looking at the little camera on my tablet, and hopefully there will be a time not too far in the future when we can actually be together. And that's actually the point of departure. Some months ago, we were headed into 2020. I work at the UN Climate Change Secretariat, so we are in this world of climate policy. And we looked back at 2019 when youth and grandparents and concerned citizens were streaming onto the streets of their cities all over the world, hundreds of thousands of people, really sending a clear signal. They want a shift in direction, they want a better future. And then the pandemic came, and now at the moment it's not safe to go out on the streets and voice the future that we want, at least not the way that we used to be able to do that. In the climate policy world, we've also experienced something that we're all experiencing, and that is our normal way of negotiating isn't possible right now. And so our mid-year climate negotiations have been postponed. It's hard to imagine, at least when the decision was made, it was hard to imagine how could we possibly negotiate something as complex as navigating the impacts of climate change and what we do to reduce it in a virtual setting. And so that's where we are. That's our point of departure. Of course, the pandemic it's a crash course in learning. And so I wanted to share with you 3 levels of challenges you may be thinking about when it comes to climate change. There are some parallels with the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'll draw some of those parallels. And then I'd like to spend the bulk of 3 minutes outlining a plan for the future and what we need to do. And then finally, a small call to action, and then we'll turn the time over to you, Mike, and hopefully we'll have a nice discussion together with all of you. So in any good story, there are a lot of challenges, and with climate change as well as COVID-19, there is massive external disruption right now. As all of you have felt, there was a virus. There is a virus amongst us. Many of us are getting sick, some very sick, and some people like me have been blessed with good health, thank goodness, but it's still out there. And we're all wondering how to go forward. With climate change, there is a whole range of physical threats that come up right now on top of COVID-19 across the continent of Africa, particularly in the tropics. There are historical swarms of locusts that are descending on croplands exactly at the time of the long rainy season.
I'm sorry, did you just say locusts like Old Testament?
Sorry, wrong vocabulary. Grasshoppers. Yes. And these insects are the locust. That's the word we're calling it. But they're devouring young crops. And in some countries, particularly in the Horn of Africa, that long rainy season produces about 80% of the food for the entire year. So you have layer of physical disruption. And we're really concerned about that. And I could go on and on. There are labor impacts, obviously, of COVID-19. Many of us have family members who've lost their jobs. Many of us stay up at night wondering whether we'll lose our jobs. And with climate change, there are not the same, but there are also impacts on jobs. There are really big impacts on food systems. Already with COVID-19, we've seen how our very long global supply chains of getting a kiwi from wherever it's grown to your breakfast table or whenever you eat kiwi, it's really long and it spans the globe. And parts of those global supply systems have broken in the pandemic. In many countries in the United States, as well as the country that I currently live in, which is Germany, tens of thousands of agricultural workers can't cross the border. About half of all agricultural labor in Europe, anyway, is done by migrant laborers. And so in Germany, in the province that I live in, just by chance, fruits and vegetables, a lot of animal husbandry, those are really migrant-heavy sectors. And already you're seeing some impacts on prices. And so we'll see these long supply chains. Food insecurity might be an issue as we progress. With climate change, food security similarly experiences those physical impacts of heat, storms, lack of rain, too much rain, all of those disruptions. But in addition, who utilizes the food, whether it's men or women, children and elderly, or people who need to go out and work on the fields, that is going to make a big difference in food security. And trade also makes a big difference. If a country that produces a lot of food has a bad crop year, say because of bad rain or a heat wave, often countries, instead of economic theory, would say the right thing to do is trade and distribute that food globally. But often in reality, countries don't exchange grain. If they need it, they prioritize domestic. So all of these different things combine. In addition to the physical disruptions, both of COVID-19 as well as climate change, obviously they're not one-to-one, but I'm just drawing some parallels. Something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about right now is almost an internal issue. How are our societies organized? Food supply chains is one. Energy systems are another way that we are organized. And the way that we're currently organized, or the way that our societies have been organized to deliver jobs and pensions and healthcare, water and food, and I could go on, energy, housing, these disruptions, COVID-19 or climate impacts, interrupt the way that we're currently organized, and they really challenge it. And it means that the way that we're currently organized might not be the right fit for the world that we're heading into in the future. And so that's also something worth thinking about. The third and final challenge is a philosophical challenge. We're more people on the planet. We have new technologies. And again, these disruptions come and cut across the way that we're used to being in the world. Maybe particularly in Western societies, not necessarily. I live in the West, in the North, so I'll just pick on that one. We tend to look at the world around us as a resource that we can extract value from. And with so many people on the planet, it really starts raising the question, philosophically, if we continue to extract, and if we continue to degrade nature, for example, how far can we go in achieving our goals of a stable and prosperous and healthy society? So it's really, that last challenge is quite philosophical. Now, I promised I'd outline 3 things in a plan, because every plan I hear has 3 steps. And there are 3 that I'd like to outline. And I draw parts of this 3-step plan that we could think about from the United Nations Secretary General, who gave a statement on Earth Day. And he emphasized 6 points, and I've slightly reorganized them. So overarching, please insist on a green recovery, particularly in the North, our industrialized countries. Governments are announcing really large stimulus packages, recovery packages. It's essential that you insist that those packages are green. And what that means is that a lot of taxpayer money, public funds, have the opportunity now to shift the direction. And they have to shift the direction in things that people care most about: health, jobs, education, and the nature around us. Those in particular, I'll mention soil and sustainable land use management. Let's just take one: green jobs. We're facing really high unemployment rates right now, and who knows what's ahead. It's really important that a recovery is green and that the jobs are green. And I went to the US Department of Statistics, and they define green jobs, as does UN Environment Program, as those jobs that help restore nature and the environment. And there are a whole bunch of jobs in this category, be it in energy, education, water, sustainable land management. So the jobs need to be green, and overall the recovery needs to be green. A second part of this plan for a green recovery is, in addition to livelihoods, we need to kind of rethink our relationship with nature as a whole. And I've mentioned now a couple of times sustainable land use management. There are many ways to do agriculture. There are many ways to manage water and biodiversity. One of the things that's been concerning as we've been learning about COVID-19 is that a lot of these zoonotic diseases pop up when people encroach on natural habitats. And you have several things happening at once: ecosystems being degraded, biodiversity being depleted, and right now about 1 million species are racing towards extinction. And we need to turn that around. A rich, healthy ecosystem with diverse life is a buffer that keeps most of us healthy. I can't say all, because life is full of ups and downs, but a healthy ecosystem with every niche of life filled is more likely to buffer against disease than one in which life is sparse and highly specialized. It's just not the way nature diversifies risk. So we need to rethink that. And then the third is we really need to invest in the future, not the past. For financial institutions, that means having a really hard think about where a green recovery goes, where investments go. It's not just financial institutions, it's the governance systems that shape the rules. Investing in a gray future doesn't sound very good. And just the color that I painted in your minds right now kind of suggests that's not where the future is. The future is in a green, healthy, vibrant society, and also one that has equity. Right now, a lot of people are hurting. There's a lot of pain. And if that gap, I just read a New York Times article, the gap between Main Street and maybe those who have a lot, if that widens, the pain will widen, and that also causes political instability. So these are 3 things that we could consider moving forward. There's a lot at stake. From a climate perspective, the Paris Agreement suggested that to keep the world in a kind of safe operating space for humanity and all of the life that supports humanity, we need to stay well below 2 degrees. Already, we're above 1 degree Celsius compared to pre-industrial times. So that gap is narrowing, and that gap will be either closed or widened in this decade. And so right now, it's really a moment of choice. With the pandemic, obviously, governments around the world hopefully have the highest priority on the health and well-being of their citizens. And that should be the focus. It's not an either-or, however, because the focus is on how do we get through this together and then continue in a prosperous, stable, and safe way. And that is the thing that we have to choose. Is that going to be a gray future or a green future? And so we really have to be thinking in a future-oriented way. And the coming 3 years, 5 years will make all of the difference in this decade. This decade must be one, not only for the pandemic, not only for our economies, but really for the long-term safety, and health of humanity. Maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.
I mean, that is so profound and important in thinking about this. And I want to pick up on something. Let me push you a little bit and pick up on something that a couple people have floated with regards to COVID-19, suggesting there are positive elements to it when it comes to confronting climate change. I mean, after all, we're flying less, we're driving less, emissions probably have gone down significantly in the last in the last couple of months. How are you, as somebody whose job it is to try to help get our world through this situation, through the climate change situation? How are you thinking about this, and do you think that any of these changes will be longer lasting, or is this something that's likely it's just going to be business as usual as soon as we can?
Yeah. Yes, emissions have gone down. There was a report by it's going to come to me, Carbon Brief, in March, so just maybe 6 weeks ago. That
March feels so long ago.
It's
so long ago.
It's been a very long year so far. But indeed, it looks like emissions, as you said, automobile traffic is down in some places by half, in some places not so much. International aviation has decreased by 80%, if what I'm reading is somewhat accurate. And so currently, emissions are down. That's good news. Of course, you're going to expect somebody working in the climate world to be glad when emissions go down. We shouldn't do a victory lap, however. The crucial element is we have to change our systems. We have to change the way we produce energy. So right now, with the pandemic, you hear it in the news, the demand for oil, the demand for fossil fuels has plummeted, even though the prices have also plummeted. It's a really interesting economic case. But once things go better, often greenhouse gases correlate positively with economic activity. And so as we recover, and again, that's why it's so crucial that we use this moment. It's not a happy moment. And so absolutely, I don't call this an opportunity, but life throws changes at us, and it is up to us as humans to choose the path that we take. I don't want to make that sound like a cliche, but if we choose to change our energy systems and where we draw our energy from, that will be a turning point. And then you'll see emissions going down. I mentioned the Paris Agreement. In order to keep temperatures at the more comfortable 1.5 degrees Celsius, not to be too wonky, above
just 1.5, right?
We would need to decrease annual global emissions by about 7.8% per year. It's taken a pandemic to get us down about 5% right now. So what that signals is, first of all, you don't want anybody to suffer a pandemic, and here we are in the middle of it. And second of all, reducing consumer demands in a system as we know it probably won't be enough. We're going to have to go further. And because we have to go into the future anyway, and because we have to recover from a pandemic anyway, why don't we do it in a way that we know will benefit humanity? And not just humanity, but also people in the country where you live.
Absolutely. And let me maybe turn to that a little bit. In the United States, there's been a lot of conversation, and important conversation, I think, about the unequal ways that COVID-19 is affecting communities. And so I want to pick up on the equality point that you made in your opening remarks. And in the climate action movement and in the communities on climate change, I know there have been some efforts to sort of center those frontline communities affected. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about how you think those efforts are going, and if there are any lessons learned for how now, as we confront this pandemic, what we should do.
Yeah, I'll take one example. You mentioned Native Americans. In my work in climate policy, I have a wonderful opportunity to work with local communities and Indigenous people. And these are some of the most disadvantaged, vulnerable groups in our societies, just in terms of, you know, indicators, wealth and health and all of those kinds of things. And so absolutely, if you look at how the pandemic is cutting across our societies, very sadly, it is those groups who have comorbidity. My vocabulary has grown so much during the pandemic. I can almost say epidemiologist. I think I got it right that time. But when you look at who's been affected in particular, you see what we need to fix in our society. It's clear. And the pandemic isn't new, but it certainly highlights what we need to do anyway. Everybody wants a great life for their children and for themselves. Everybody needs clean water. And I'm mentioning now a couple of areas for a United States audience that have no left or right or red or blue. If you poll or follow polling results, everybody cares about clean water. Everybody cares about things like pollinators. Who would have thought? But there are these issues that happen to be in nature that people really care about. And anyway, I digress. The last point that I wanted to say about Indigenous people and local communities is something else. And this is kind of particular to Indigenous people. In the climate negotiations, I hope some of you come. They're really interesting. When our Indigenous peoples meet, they'll perform. We create a space for them where they can practice their cultural practices. And so we'll often start a meeting with a ceremony. For them, it's very sacred. And their prayers and their songs, without exception, place themselves within the world. They're not separate from nature. They're part of it. And it's their culture and it's their values. But for example, Chief Thompson will talk about thinking about 7 generations in the past and learning from past experience and thinking long-term, 7 generations in the future. And our colleagues at Wharton, one of the best business schools in the world, they may have a different vocabulary, but when they talk about long-term planning, they may find intersection. So what I want to kind of mention is, although some people who in some content we want, and hopefully build that together.
Well, great. Well, I want to turn now to some questions from the audience. We've got 150, 175 people that have hopped on to listen, and one question involves in some ways moving from, you know, recognizing these communities to the notion of action and in protest. And, you know, many people have spoken about how the inability to gather in protests might slow down government support for climate action. Are there any opportunities for mobilization, essentially, when we can't gather in person to meet in protest?
Absolutely. I'll maybe mention 2.5 things. So last year, and actually it was a little more than a year, but the youth movement astounded us. And in the climate world, it was really breathtaking to see these, you know, sweet kids, teenagers, young adults, really taking a stand and doing so in such a visual way, out on the streets. And obviously that's not a safe thing right now with this virus going around. And so, you know, many people, the second thing that I want to say is also the climate negotiations, that we have a cycle, like any decision-making process. You have to have a discussion of what needs to be done, and then you need to prepare the decision and make sure everybody kind of agrees and everybody's perspectives are taken into account, and then you have to decide. And it's very United Nations. But for us, having all the voices at the table is important. And when it became clear that we couldn't have that gathering of, it's literally thousands and thousands of people, some bigger, some smaller, but it's always in the tens of thousands. You know, a lot of people said, oh, well, then climate action and progress on climate change, it's postponed. And we just can't afford that. That's what's at stake. We cannot afford to stand still. And so the last point, maybe half a point, because we're all learning, the physical, very visible meetings, they're not happening right now. Many other things are happening. You hear about Zoom fatigue. I think that the upside of Zoom fatigue or video conferencing fatigue is I've never seen a time when networks of people have been more active, obviously sharing their experiences about what they're experiencing with the pandemic, but also in their areas of climate change, for example, our networks are extremely active. And I would, really hope that our audience, which is a very, special group of professionals and people, will do that. Probably needs to be visible. You need to be effective, maybe on social media. And that's why it's only half an answer, because social movements and all of that, really, they're not my specialty. But the downside is we're not meeting physically, but the upside is you don't have to hop on a plane right now and spend half a day getting to a meeting. You can join 5 meetings in a day. Yay, on Zoom. But the point is there are chances to connect with people. We're just in a crash course of doing things different. It doesn't mean progress stops.
So what about the question of collective action? And and I say this, from the perspective of being, in the United States, where we've had sort of pretty short-term collective action over the last few months, which for Americans has been very disruptive. Wearing masks, staying at home. I mean, the American public famously is difficult to tame, and you see that in some of the pictures of protests in places and things like state capitals. And are there lessons here, you think, for imagining collective action in the climate change space? Sorry.
Yeah.
What can we get from this?
Well, first of all, absolutely lessons. And second of all, I'm about to give you a bunch of cliches, because it's very hard. It is very hard to change. And if you asked me about something really close and personal to me, I wouldn't want to change it. Nobody does. We're humans. We like things to be stable and that which we can expect. So in terms of collective action, I will mention an example that I think is really interesting right now. Many of our societies, we're all in delays by some weeks. Europe is some weeks ahead of the United States because it came to Europe before it made its way across the Pacific and the Atlantic. So on the one hand, there are active debates in all of our societies about how strict or how not strict measures should be. Do we wear a face mask? Do we not? Etc. And the trick with the virus is that if a few people don't comply or don't do that which is requisite, kind of ruins it for the rest of the people. You can have one super infected person, right, if that's such a thing, go around to nightclubs and restaurants and go to hospitals and soccer games and can be in contact easily with 1,000 people. And with climate change, one of our similar dilemmas is this is a deep collective action issue. We all need to have a joint vision. It's one reason why the Paris Agreement is for us so essential, because countries agreed that's the direction we're going. We're staying below 2 degrees Celsius. Without that, some countries may have said, no, 4 is fine. Other countries, if you're a small island state, 4 is definitely not fine, and neither is 2 degrees. And so, our collective action dilemma, and that which we tirelessly tackle every day, is how do we act together? If some countries, and that's the world that we live in, if some countries choose not to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, not to transition their energy systems, not to manage their land in climate neutral ways, all of us will be affected. Not all the same, but I really draw the kind of parallels. One upside is at the beginning, I don't know, was it March, so long ago, in Germany where I live, there was a lot of different messaging about face masks. You'd see these images on TV of people in Asia, they're all wearing face masks. And I remember thinking to myself, whatever. And when it started getting closer that face masks needed to be worn here, I literally remember the day before that needed to be implemented. It was like a Monday, and on a Sunday, I somehow inside was gleeful that I didn't have to wear a mask yet. But then the Monday came, I put on my little mask, I went and got some milk at the grocery store, and it wasn't such a big deal.
Right.
And so there's also that, that's also just a completely personal experience, but one thing that's really impressed me is how truly adaptable we are as people. Not to all things, right, but we learn, and what becomes normal changes, and sometimes it can change in a matter of weeks.
It's a great point. So let me follow up on something at the intersection of the bunch of things we've talked about that gets into a specific public policy area relevant for both COVID and climate change, and that's public transport. On the one hand, if you think about urban development and climate change, there's a strong argument for public transport as a way to reduce emissions. But on the other hand, people might fear public transportation now due to it might violate social distancing policies, et cetera. How should we be thinking about that?
Good question. I'm going to shoot out here, but with the disclaimer that public transport isn't my area. So
it's not mine either.
Okay. There are probably people who are listening who know a lot about public transport. So from an energy efficiency, and especially if you've got vehicles that are running maybe on electricity, and hopefully that electricity comes from a renewable source, public transport is a way to do a whole bunch of things that are really good for society in a non-pandemic world. You can get a lot of people to work for relatively low amounts. The amount it takes to have a vehicle versus to take the bus it's a big difference. Less expensive typically. And by the way, I'm assuming that this is a kind of semi-urban or urban environment, not that you have to take a bus for 2 hours to get to work. In a pandemic situation where the threat comes from proximity to people, I'll just speak to what I'm experiencing here. Our metro system, Germany has an excellent train system, superb public transport, and I'm a big fan, so disclaimer. But here, they've given the public, it's also a very rule-abiding town that I live in, if not country. And so they've given—
you live in Germany.
I live in Germany. They follow the rules. So, they've given us guidelines to space out where we sit. They've increased the amount of metro or U-Bahn subways and buses that go. And so they're just encouraging people. In some cases in the trains, they'll tape off, the distances so that people can see. They need to space themselves out. And the kind of the over availability of public transport means that you don't really have to limit yourself. You can use public transport. So I think it's very context specific. Some people have no opportunity to even use public transport because it's not available, either because they're living in a sparsely populated area, or maybe their country doesn't have that system.
So let me ask a question on a slightly different angle, which is about the role of science and expertise in the public sphere. Yes. It's another question from the Q&A. We chatted about it a bit as well. There have been some commentaries that a similarity between climate change activism and the management of COVID is that both hinge on trust in science and expert knowledge, and that in some ways the polling data on COVID suggests that people actually believe in experts. Most people believe in experts more than maybe we might have thought. Could there be a spillover? Here, let me ask a good news question, and then maybe you can shoot it down potentially. Could there be a spillover that actually makes people more likely now to believe the science on climate change?
Again, a disclaimer. I've had the chance to be a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So and the job of that is just a volunteer who reads a lot of journal articles and then writes a report about the summary. And also in the climate change process, our process is based on the best available science. I'm also aware that not all people embrace science, and not all people embrace factfulness, which is, it concerns me. If we are a society that does not base our decisions and our behavior on factfulness, I think that could be a collision course with reality. So, but not to go too much in that direction. One thing I have noticed is, again, epidemiologists have surged to the forefront and they're speaking to us every day. My vocabulary has grown a lot. And at the beginning, this idea of flattening the curve took me a bit to get my head around it. I was thinking of my Stats 101 course and trying to figure out what it meant, but the increasing familiarity with what the scientists and experts were telling me intersected with exactly what I wanted to know. And in the case of a virus, I'm a citizen, just a person on the street like anybody else. This isn't an area that I know a lot about, but I wanted to know how many people are affected, how many people in my neighborhood or in my town are affected. Is it serious? When will it go away? When can I get back to whatever the new normal is going to be? And these numbers, I don't know how many times I'm still refreshing my browser on the Johns Hopkins COVID-19 world map, but I'm consistently now looking at the numbers and deriving what that means for my life. And I think that is a wonderful intersection between society and science. Ideally, society has clearly articulated questions, and they're often very hard to answer, but they're not really hard questions. They are when, where, who, how do we do this, what's going to happen, what's happening, when is it going to be over, those questions. And if science can weigh in very clearly in a very timely way, then it's a fantastic thing. In Germany, probably in towns that you live in, our policymakers, our mayors, our governors, our national leaders, I'm not a German citizen, I'm from the US, but they are governing right now according to the numbers. I know not every country is that way, but I think it's an amazing, it's an amazing opportunity to really give science a chance and be factful.
So you might be recall for those online that I suggested. I mentioned that Koko has a PhD in economics, which means claiming that she had to go back to her intro statistics class. You're certainly the most modest economist in the world then, but since you have a PhD, all right. Let's shift back to the local a little bit and talk about, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that get to the question of individuals who want to do something to be helpful from a climate change perspective, but who say, maybe live in countries where their governments aren't, maybe doing as much as they could to contribute to the cause. And so, do you have any suggestions about what individuals could do, both either to advocate in a helpful way or to sort of change their actions? And I can say this also as a faculty member, when I talk to my students, if you ask them what are the most important things in the world, I mean, right now they probably say COVID, but normally their climate change is always in the top 3, but they always struggle to try to get their head around what can they do.
A lot. And again, here, we're always looking for the new, not magic solution, because we shouldn't, go in the direction of magic, but I wish there was magic, because we really need solutions. And the thing is, with climate change, we do know the solutions. And with the virus, we don't know the details, but we do know the solution. We know for a virus, the general solution is an equitable society, a good healthcare system. That's a hard one, but we know what the solution is. And then on top of that, we know good hygiene and appropriate physical distance and rest, etc. With climate change, we also know the solutions, and these solutions we know in some detail. We always want to know more. So again, there's the role of science and expertise. With climate change, we know the solution is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that points to areas in our society that need change, our energy systems. We need to transition in a just way from coal, natural gas, fossil fuels of all kinds. We need to transition away from those towards renewable energy sources. Of course, the devil's in the detail. And so here's one example that I've experienced and some of you may have. And this also relates to COVID, but many of us who have jobs and have that luck and privilege have just moved where we do our work. Some of us work from home, not everybody. Clearly the frontline workers are out there and they're heroes, they're wonderful. For me though, I work at home. And so I've just moved where I use my energy. I'm using the same amount of electricity. The difference is, however, that in my province and in many areas of the world, the housing sector has already made the transition, not entirely, but they're already making pretty significant inroads in renewable energy, and that's really interesting. Industrial production is down. We have an economic, a really bad economic situation right now in tandem with the pandemic. For when you move your electricity to where that transition has already happened, picture doesn't look so bad. And so what local people can do, they can ask their energy companies or they can sign up for energy. Maybe 5 months ago, that would have seemed like a very moderate ask, but we see now that a whole bunch of moderate or even small steps, when you have this big unforeseen systemic shift, they make a big difference. Other solutions that we know of, if you're in the tech industry, take a look at new forms of food systems, or I could go on and on. We know the solutions. I just mentioned a really simple one in energy, but they're in energy, sustainable land use management, forestry. They're both in our consumption as well as our production. And the very first step starts with go home tonight, have a conversation with your family or your friends about climate change. And to avoid what might seem like a political conversation, you could say, what's the future that you want? Or show them a picture of something that you've dug up that's related to climate change and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about this? And then say, what would it take to make it a little bit better? Don't get into a political discussion. Just say, how do you feel about this? And what does it take to make it better? That's a way to have a really important discussion without making it, these harsh, confrontative conversations. Those aren't necessary. We've got to connect with one another. We really have to think about the future that we want to build together now.
So is there an element here that is maybe a little bit about how options are framed, and that people don't like sacrificing things? They want to be able to drive their car. They want to be able to go to a restaurant. They want, whether we're talking about COVID or climate change, are there public policy options we could think about that we could maybe frame more as, behavioral changes that people might enjoy or support, that might also have benefits? There's a Q&A question that asks about bicycling as opposed to driving, and sort of making things more safe for bicycles, and maybe that could work better in Europe than in some parts of the US at least. But is there a bit about this, to go to your PhD training, and that's a behavioral econ question almost, about how do you nudge people? And do you have any ideas about public policy ideas we could think about? Yes,
most definitely. So I love the bicycle example, one, because I love to bike, so again, a bias. But there is an e-bike company that I've heard of. I don't know, I think it's in Tennessee. And they've got this logo or this kind of catchphrase that says, "Life is too short to be stuck in traffic." And then as you go on, this is just their website. And then it's, it's great for your health. You don't waste time stuck in traffic. I've never been to Tennessee, so I don't know what the climate is like. And they kind of list a whole bunch of positive things that can come from, buying their bicycle or their electric bike. And I mentioned that just as a whimsical example. And I'll go back to what I said about polls that show areas of consensus. People want water, they want pollinators, they want a good future. And the better that we can do, I think we've learned from a decade or more of, or whatever, how much time have we been frightened and having fear-based, this is terrible, and the ceiling's coming down and wheels are falling off the bus. People need to be aware of the risk, but they similarly need to be aware of the only possible options ahead of them. And again, it reminds me, my answers are so long. I'm sorry, Michael, just get me talking.
This is great.
But in one of our conversations, I may have mentioned to you, I read this actually it was a sound recording from 1957, Russell Bertrand, philosopher from the 20th century. He was giving a speech.
You're going deep in the intellectual well there.
Incredible. So he gave a speech about Britain's decision to either get into the nuclear arms race or remain back and not go that direction. So it was, structurally, it was this important cross in the road, and they had to decide. And what Bertrand Russell said, he didn't want the UK to engage in that. He said, it's a lose-lose, we shouldn't go down that road. But the structure of his speech was, and this comes kind of towards the end, and he said, in the past, most of human suffering has been the result of two things, just ignorance and folly, bad decision-making. And he said now, and this is 1957, I love it, he's like, it's the scientific age, and humanity is reaching for the moon and the stars, and look where we are now, even that much more advanced in our technology and science. Anyway, so back in 1957, he said, we're not ignorant anymore. We know. We have science. We have all of these tools. So all that remains is folly. And if we choose well, then we have an untold bright future ahead. And if you look back at the past 70 years, the lives of our parents, the advances that humanity has made, not in all areas, but in many, it was beautiful. And they did it. Bunch of wrong decisions, but in general, we didn't have a nuclear winter or nuclear holocaust. If we choose wrong, however, it could be a very gray and gloomy future. And I think that lesson, that speech from Russell Bertrand, really, I think about it a lot when it comes to our work in climate change, as well as how we deal with pandemics and all of the disruptions that are kind of out and about in the world.
So speaking of the scientific age, we love technology, as societies, certainly in the United States and Germany and elsewhere. And, with regard to COVID, the technology we're looking for is a vaccine. Here's our one-shot thing that could fix everything. And, obviously this, this is a false analogy in many ways, but there are elements of optimism potentially about the ability to utilize maybe emerging technologies to help from a climate change perspective. Are there any things that you would point to, or is there anything that might be a silver bullet? Like, please say yes. And if there's not, how should we be thinking about how we can leverage technology to maybe assist in the fight against climate change?
Well, I think cold fusion would be wonderful. So speaking
of silver bullets, yeah,
would love that. With climate change, I'd love to be able to say this or that technology. But we know the answers, we know the solutions. They're difficult. We got to go there because everything is on the line. And it's difficult, it's painful conversation. but that is the history that we are making together. That's the future that we're building together. We need to transition in a just way away from fossil fuels. We didn't know it at the time, but now we do know that the way that we create energy today based on fossil fuels won't work for the future. We know the way that we deal with our soils and do agriculture. We know our diets need to change. That's the way that we're currently living. We need to evolve, just like little kids grow up. We go from one stage to another. That's where we are right now. And so I know that all sounds really cliche. The hard work is figuring out how we're going to do this together. And it's similar with COVID-19 measures. You know, maybe people get irritated about a whole bunch of things, and it's way worse than irritation. There's unemployment and really devastating impacts of our policy decisions. But we need to go that way together. And the more that we can come together, as difficult as it is, we can't avoid those hard conversations, the more progress that we'll make.
So there are a couple of questions in the Q&A building on the collective action discussion from before that ask about leadership coming not from governments and specifically from the private sector. And there's another question that then asked about whether corporations will use COVID as an excuse to roll back actions that they were going to take on climate change. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about what you think the role of the private sector is in confronting climate change, and whether, and tell us a little bit about what you think maybe the risks and upsides could be from how that interacts with the current crisis that we're in.
Okay. Okay, with the private sector is the source of most people's jobs. Not only, many people are employed by governments and the public sector, but the private sector provides jobs. And so moving forward, and also disclaimer, I work for the United Nations, so obviously I'm very aspirational, but I'm going to that's me. So the private sector needs to provide jobs. They need to be safe, equitable, and green. There's also something that's coming anyway. We are referred to it whatever you want, whether it's a fourth industrial revolution, but we are in a moment of deep structural change in our labor markets. And the private sector has kind of a driving role in that change. How do we use machines, and what role do people continue to play in the labor market? And that is in some ways being accelerated by COVID-19. And again, why I mentioned green jobs is green jobs provide some hope, and there are all kinds of different green jobs, but they do provide some hope that those kinds of new jobs that the private sector invents will provide more resilience and robust livelihood options, even in a climate stressed world. So jobs are one. You mentioned the possibility that corporations might find loopholes. I read an article a couple of weeks ago that part of the current US administration's response efforts against COVID-19 are rolling back 100 or so EPA regulations on clean water, clean air, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the right direction if you want a healthy, safe, stable society. We need clean water in every aspect that you can imagine. You need clean water to drink, et cetera. I don't even have to go there. The right direction is for corporations in the private sector. And in fact, I heard this around the time of the World Economic Forum. That's in January in Switzerland. So actually, some of the best performing companies don't see an either or between environmental goods, which are public goods often, and their bottom line. So they're already seeing that environment, sustainability, good governance, being good to their labor or to their workforce actually align and make them better companies. Not all companies are like that, but maybe I've said enough. The private sector is critical, and I would hope, as we see some energy companies, many energy companies are obviously very hard hit by extremely low oil prices right now. And some.
Yeah, I was going to ask a follow-up about oil prices and whether whether you woke up in the middle of the night worried about low oil prices and how it will affect the climate change efforts.
I mean, crazy. The reason why people aren't driving right now, for the most part, is because we have a really very difficult economic situation. And for this particular phase, many of us are in lockdown, so it's not like you're driving around. Right. So the price of oil tends to be relatively inelastic, and so if it's more expensive, less expensive, you still need a tank of gas to do your stuff around town or get to your job. And so it's not that people are going to go and be doing joyriding because the price of fuel is low, according to economic theory. But what I wanted to say was renewables are price competitive, especially if you take away subsidies. So again, with how we recover from the pandemic, this is a key moment. How do we want to recover? Obviously, we want to recover into a world that we know we want to go to anyway, a good world, a safe world, not a hot world where we have biodiversity crashing and where food security is a constant issue. So I digress a little bit, but all of these they're really hard fought areas. But it's incredible. COVID is so powerful. It is changing systems so powerfully right now. But going back to the collective action question, or citizens that want to get engaged, raise your voice. There's so much change happening right now. Reach out to your representatives, write them letters, whatever is effective. Let them know where you want to go. And I hope you want to go towards a green recovery. This is the time to be vocal about what you want.
It's hard not to be optimistic when talking to you. You bring that energy and excitement, and we've just got a couple minutes left. So let me take you out on a question actually designed to provoke some optimism, maybe, in that it's the version of something that we've asked every guest since we've started our series of virtual events, which is, have you seen anything during this pandemic on the local, national, international level that makes you hopeful about our ability to face the challenge of climate change and mitigate and adapt in more effective ways? Koko, tell us something good.
It's going to be a mixed bag because I'm from the U.S. and pardon me if I repeat. There are a couple of stories in the past that have really impressed me, so I tend to repeat them. But you'll hear with the economic and particularly unemployment impacts of the pandemic, comparisons with the Great Depression in the United States. And Federal Delano Roosevelt, during that time, talked a lot to people. And just as a backstory, he had polio, very painful, really difficult. But he had gone through the dregs and had a really difficult setback in his life. It actually, was with him until the end of his life. But he talked to people and gave them comfort and hope. And he also did very practical things. He set up a New Deal. He got people working again. And this then leads me to the third point. It's not a happy one, but when the United States entered World War II, they needed to build tanks and get soldiers uniforms and boots and et cetera, and God forbid, we're not going to war. And so I'm hesitant to make a wartime example or comparison, but the president called together all of the industrialists. And we've seen that happening in the United States with automakers. So something similar happened back in the day. And he said, gentlemen, and hopefully a couple of ladies back then, he said, look, this is my ambitious list of things that you need to accomplish to get the United States ready to go into this battle to end all battles, war of whatever, terrible. And the industrialists did a huddle and they came back and said, well, Mr. President, we are patriots. You have our full support and we've come with an alternative plan. we would, you see, your plan, if we follow your plan, we won't be able to produce automobiles, and that's our business. So obviously we need to do that. So let's just do a little bit less. And the FDR said, no, you don't understand. You will follow this plan. We need you to do this plan to meet these goals. And they were really ambitious. And so that's what they did. No new automobiles were produced in the United States for some years, maybe 2-3 years.
Right.
And the industrialists, not only did they meet every target, but they exceeded it. And the comparison with the pandemic, and that which gives me hope for climate change, is to, not to be too cliche, but when there is an alignment in will, we can do a lot. I was astounded, as painful as the lockdowns have been, I was astounded that world leaders could even do that. And I was doubly astounded that people went along with it, at least for a time. Let's see. But hey, if we can mobilize our resources to make a shift, certainly we could do that with energy systems. And if we could come together and change our behavior in such a dramatic way during the lockdown, most people have been compliant for this period of time. Then why can't we do that for climate change? We've done it in the past, and I do take hope, as hard as it is. And, you know, even though there's no silver bullet, we know the solutions, now we have to do it. But we've just showed, we're showing right now, if we want it, we will do it.
Well, on using one of an inspiring American success story is a great way to make me optimistic about our future. And I hope everyone will join me in thanking Dr. Koko Warner for educating us all about the interconnectedness between climate change and COVID, and ending with a little bit of optimism about our ability to mobilize to deal with the challenge of climate change. I hope everyone will join us next week as well. We have 2 great events. The first on Monday features Dr. David Heyman, a World Health Organization advisor and a former Assistant Secretary General of the World Health Organization. And then Wednesday, in partnership with the German Marshall Fund, we will be following up to get another check-in with Dr. Zeke Emanuel, one of the world's leading global public health experts, and also a vice provost here at the University of Pennsylvania. I hope everybody is safe and healthy, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Have a great week. Thanks.